Tonight we're crawling back about 30,000 years to meet a woman the movies have lied to you about for a solid century. You know the version: torn one-shoulder fur, enormous hair, waiting at the cave mouth for a man to drag dinner home by its ankles. She never existed. She's a costume. Roughly as accurate as a cartoon dog driving a convertible. The real woman was a chemist, a textile engineer, a botanist who knew a couple hundred plants by heart, a hide tanner, a midwife, and on more than a few occasions a person who could bring down an animal bigger than herself and walk home unbothered. She wrote none of it down, because writing was still tens of thousands of years away. What she left instead was quieter, the wear on her teeth, beads threaded in an order that mattered, pigment ground fine in a hollow bone, and the occasional grave so carefully arranged you can still feel, across all those millennia, that somebody loved the person inside it. So that's where we're going tonight. Not one cave, but a whole drifting Ice Age world of them, scattered across a cold meadow stocked with enormous animals, where small bands moved with the herds and the women. The ones the textbooks spent 100 years forgetting, did a staggering share of the work that kept everyone alive. We'll take it slowly, one scene at a time. If these quiet histories help you drift off, a like and a subscribe help others find them too. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and your local time. I love seeing the little map of everyone drifting off together. Then the wind down, the same gentle ritual as always. Dim the lights, or just turn them off. If a little white noise helps, switch on a fan and let it hum under everything. Get yourself comfortable. Set your phone aside or turn it face down, and bring the screen brightness all the way down to nothing, because that cold blue glow is the one thing in this room actively trying to keep you awake. And plug the phone into its charger so it doesn't quietly run out somewhere in the third hour. Done? Good. Settle in. So what was she actually like, this woman we've spent a century cartooning? What did she do between waking up cold and going back to sleep cold? Did she really just wait at home? And if she didn't, who decided that she did? And why did we believe them for so long? What was on her teeth that tells us she spent hours with sinew or plant fibre pulled tight between them? Why are there thousands of small carved figures of women across Ice Age Europe and almost no carved men? And who was holding the carving tool? Whose handprints are those on the cave walls, pressed in pigment 40,000 years ago? And why do the proportions keep coming back, suspiciously often as female? What happens to the whole tidy story of the men hunted and the women gathered when you dig up a young woman buried with a full big game hunting kit, laid in the ground with the tools of exactly the job she wasn't supposed to have? We're going to wander through all of it tonight, slowly, with the fire going. None of it is settled. All of it is more interesting than the costume. You've just woken up, and the first thing you notice is that the fire has burned down to a soft orange memory of itself, and somebody, not you, has the job of bringing it back, which means somebody got up in the dark before you did, and that somebody is probably an older woman who sleeps lightly now and has appointed herself the unofficial keeper of the embers. We'll be seeing more of her. For now you're lying on a bed that is much better than the word cave prepared you for, hides over a springy layer of dried grass and aromatic plants, and we know about the aromatic plants, because at a site called Sibudu, in what's now South Africa, people were laying down bedding made partly of leaves whose natural chemistry discourages biting insects, which is to say, somebody worked out bug-repellent mattress stuffing tens of thousands of years before anyone could write the recipe down. The air is cold enough to see, and it smells of wood smoke and animal fat and the particular green sharpness of crushed plants, and somewhere past the fire there is the low sound of someone already working. A scrape, a pause, a scrape, because the work that kept an Ice Age band alive did not wait politely for everyone to be ready. You sit up into a morning that has no clock and no calendar, and yet is more scheduled than it looks. Because the cold imposes its own timetable, the fire cannot go out, the water source is a walk away, and the walk is worse if you leave it late. The hide stretched on its frame needs working before it stiffens. And the light, when it comes, is short, and you do not waste it. Notice what you are not doing. You are not waiting for anyone. The whole image of the waiting woman falls apart the instant you actually inhabit one of these mornings, because there is simply too much to do and too few hands to do it. And the idea that half the adults in a small, cold, hungry group would specialize in standing around is the kind of thing that only sounds plausible if you've never been cold and hungry in a small group. Everyone works. The question is only what the work is, and the answer, it turns out, has been hiding in the women's own skeletons the whole time, waiting for someone to bother looking. We'll get to what their bones quietly confess. First, let's see who else is awake. The older woman tending the embers is, statistically, one of the most important people in the entire band. And for a long time, nobody studying these groups gave her a second thought. Partly because she didn't hunt and didn't carve anything that survived, and partly because the people doing the studying were mostly looking for spear points and glory. What she had instead was the single rarest and most valuable thing a non-literate society possesses, which is a very long memory. She remembered the year the river moved. She remembered which plant looked exactly like the good one, but would leave you regretting the afternoon. She remembered the cousin who married into the group 3 valleys over, which mattered enormously when the food failed and you needed somewhere to go. She was the database. She was the map and the recipe book and the medical text. And she ran on dried berries and the warmth of a fire she refused to let go out. There's a real idea behind this, argued seriously by anthropologists, sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis, and it points at something genuinely strange about our species. Human women, almost uniquely among animals, carry on living for decades after they can no longer have children. From a cold evolutionary angle that looks like a glitch, but it stops looking like a glitch the moment you notice that a grandmother who is done having her own children is suddenly free to pour everything she has into keeping her daughter's children fed and alive, and that the band's lucky enough to have one of these living libraries simply did better. The light staying on into old age may be one of the quiet engines of how we became us. She is also, frankly, in charge of more than she'd admit. The fire is technically everyone's responsibility, which is exactly why it would go out constantly without one specific person treating it as a personal insult whenever it dipped, and she is that person. She has opinions about how the youngest woman is scraping that hide, and she will share them. She knows which of the men is exaggerating about the hunt and by how much. She is the reason the band has not, this winter, eaten the plant that looks so much like the good one. Keep her in mind as we go, because she's going to keep turning up, by the fire, at the births, beside the graves, quietly holding the whole thing together while history looks straight past her at the men with the spears. Speaking of which, it's time we talked about who was actually holding those spears, because a young woman in a high mountain grave is about to make the textbooks very uncomfortable. 9,000 years ago, on a cold plateau in the Andes nearly 4 kilometers above the sea, somebody dug a grave at a place we now call Willemaya Pachixa, and laid a young hunter inside it with the full kit. Stone points for bringing down big game, blades for the butchering that came after, scrapers and flakes and the ochre you'd use to treat a hide. A complete professional tool set, arranged with care. And when archaeologists examined the bones in 2018, expecting the obvious, the bones declined to cooperate, because the hunter was a woman, somewhere between 17 and 19 years old, and the protein in her tooth enamel, a quiet chemical signature that doesn't care what anyone wants the answer to be. Confirmed it without much room for argument. Now, one grave can be an exception. The team that found her knew that, and rather than build a cathedral on a single skeleton, they did the unglamorous, properly scientific thing, and went back through every comparable burial they could find across the Americas from roughly the same deep stretch of time. They turned up more than 24 individuals buried with big game hunting tools, and somewhere between a third and a half of them were female. That is not a rounding error. That is not one remarkable tomboy the textbooks can wave away with an anecdote. That is a pattern wide enough to suggest that, in these early American populations at least, going out after the largest animals on the landscape was simply something a fair number of women did, routinely enough that nobody at the time apparently thought it worth remarking on. You have to sit with how upside down this is from the story most of us absorbed without noticing. The whole tidy architecture, men out chasing meat, women back at camp minding the plants and the children, turns out to rest on a surprisingly thin foundation, built in no small part by 20th century researchers who saw a stone point next to a skeleton and simply wrote male in the notebook without checking, because of course it was male. What else would it be? They weren't reading the evidence. They were reading themselves into the evidence, which is a much older human habit than any of the tools in that grave. The young woman on the plateau spent her short life doing skilled, dangerous, essential work at an altitude that would leave most of us dizzy, and then she lay quietly under the Andes for 9,000 years, waiting for someone to walk up with the right question instead of the ready-made answer. We don't know her name. We know her job. Tonight that feels like enough. Here is a thing that almost never makes it into the cave paintings of our imagination, and it is arguably more important to human survival than any spear ever thrown. String. Cordage, twisted plant fibre. The single most underrated technology of the Stone Age, invisible in the record for the worst possible reason: it rots. Stone lasts. Bone lasts. A length of twisted nettle fibre lasts about as long as a sandcastle. Which is why for a century the story of human ingenuity got told almost entirely through the hard, sharp, durable things, while the soft technology that may have done more to keep people alive quietly dissolved in the ground and took its inventors' reputations with it. But it left a trace. In 2020, researchers studying a Neanderthal site in France found, fused to a stone tool, a fragment of cord, 3 bundles of plant fibre twisted together, the same way you'd twist them today, made tens of thousands of years before our own species was even the main character in Europe. 3-ply cord. That's not an accident of fibres happening to lie next to each other. That's a deliberate, learned, multi-step technique, and somebody had to know it, and somebody had to teach it. Once you can make a strong, thin line, the whole world reorganizes around you. You can lash a point to a shaft. You can make a net, and a net turns hunting from a thing that requires great strength and nerve into a thing that requires patience and cleverness, and many hands working together. Work that in the ethnographic record of recent foraging peoples very often falls to women and children and the old, the exact people the Spear and Glory story wrote out. You can make a bag, and a bag means you can carry more home than your 2 arms allow, which means a gathering trip stops being limited by your armful and starts being limited by your ambition. You can make a sling to hold a baby against your body and free both hands, which quietly rewrites what a woman with an infant is able to do all day. The archaeologist Elizabeth Wayland Barber gave this its name decades ago. She called it, only half joking, the string revolution, and made the case that spinning and twisting and weaving fibre was very likely women's deep specialty stretching back into a past we can barely see, precisely because it could be done with a child nearby, set down and picked up learned young, refined over a lifetime. The tragedy of it is purely one of preservation. If string survived the way flint survives, our entire mental picture of these people would be draped in it. Bags and nets and slings and snares and woven mats and the soft ingenious web that actually held a Stone Age life together, and the woman with the spindle of twisted nettle in her lap might be standing right where the man with the spear has stood, alone. For 100 years of museum dioramas. Hold on to the string. It's going to come back, knotted into a few more places before the night is out. A person's teeth keep a diary they cannot help keeping, and they do not lie, and they do not flatter, and this turns out to be very inconvenient for anyone who wanted the past to stay tidy. When you spend a lifetime pulling fibre or sinew through your front teeth to soften it, to split it, to hold it taut while both hands do something more delicate, you leave grooves, tiny characteristic notches worn into the enamel at an angle no diet could explain. And those grooves show up on women's teeth across a great sweep of prehistory, again and again, the unmistakable signature of someone who used her mouth as a third hand for hours a day, every day, for years. It goes further and stranger. Researchers studying the dental tartar, the hardened plaque your dentist scrapes off, which on an ancient skeleton becomes a little time capsule cemented to the tooth, have pulled fibres right out of it, including, at one Neolithic site, fibres dyed blue and pink, the residue of textile work caught and preserved in the very mouths of the women doing it. Picture the moment that lands in a lab. You are looking through a microscope at the literal threads of a forgotten craft, fossilised in someone's tartar, the dye still faintly there. The woman never knew she'd kept the receipt. She kept it anyway. The teeth confess other things too. There's a now famous case of a woman from around 1,000 years ago, later than our deep Ice Age window, but it makes the point with a brightness that's hard to ignore, found with flecks of brilliant blue locked in her dental plaque, the unmistakable ultramarine of ground lapis lazuli, a pigment so costly and so rare that its presence in her mouth quietly demolished the assumption that the people illuminating precious manuscripts were exclusively men. She'd been licking the tip of her brush to a point, the way painters do, swallowing the story of her own profession one fine blue particle at a time, and it sat in her mouth for a millennium waiting to contradict everyone. The lesson keeps repeating, all the way down, the work women did was real and skilled, and it left marks, and the only reason we ever doubted it is that nobody thought to check the teeth. The grandmother by the fire, by the way, has worn down teeth of exactly this kind, and she'd tell you each groove cost her something if you asked, which nobody did for a very long time. Somewhere in the cold heart of the last ice age, a person sat down with a piece of mammoth ivory, or soft stone, or fired clay, and carved a small figure of a woman. And then somebody else did it again, hundreds of kilometres away, and again, across thousands of years and an entire continent, until we ended up with the strangest fact in all of Ice Age art, by far the most common subject. These people chose to render was the female body. We call them Venus figurines, which is a silly borrowed name nobody at the time would have recognised, and they turn up from France to Siberia, small enough to close your hand around, often without much in the way of a face, frequently emphasising the parts of the body involved in carrying and feeding a child. For a long stretch of the 20th century, the men interpreting these objects landed, with remarkable confidence, on the theory that they were essentially prehistoric pin-ups, carved by men for men, as objects of desire. It is genuinely hard to overstate how much this interpretation tells you about the 20th century, and how little it may tell you about the Ice Age. Because look again at the figurines and notice something the pin-up theory has to ignore. the proportions are strange in a very specific way. The upper body shrinks, the feet taper to almost nothing, the breasts and belly loom large and near, and when an anthropologist named Catherine McCoyd and a geologist named Leroy McDermott looked at that distortion in the 1990s, they had a quietly devastating idea. What if these aren't men's views of women at all? What if they're women's views of themselves? What you see when you are pregnant and you look down at your own body without a mirror, foreshortened. Your feet small and far away, your belly the nearest and largest thing in the world. Carve what you see looking down, and you carve a Venus. We can't prove it. That's the honest part, and I'd rather give you the honest part than the tidy one. Nobody can climb inside the head of someone who lived 25,000 years ago and read their intentions, and serious people still argue about every one of these little figures. But the McDermott idea did something valuable, even if it's only partly right. It cracked open the door to the possibility that the most widespread art of the Ice Age was women looking at themselves, recording their own bodies, making sense of the astonishing and dangerous thing those bodies could do, and that the carver so often quietly assumed to be a man might just as easily have been the woman holding the mirror that didn't exist yet, the original of every self-portrait that's been made since. You could fit one in your palm. Imagine falling asleep with that small cold weight of someone's self-knowledge resting in your hand, 25,000 years old, still warm from the telling. Press your palm flat against a cold stone wall in the dark, take a mouthful of powdered red ochre and water, and blow it in a fine spray across the back of your hand, and when you lift your hand away, there is a perfect ghost of it, left behind in negative. A pale hand inside a red cloud, your own outline, signed without ink. People did exactly this in caves across the world, from Spain to Sulawesi, tens of thousands of years ago, and these stenciled hands are some of the most directly human things the deep past has left us. No spear between you and them, no interpretation needed, just somebody's hand, the same shape as yours, saying the oldest sentence there is, which is simply "I was here." For most of the time we've known about these handprints, the quiet assumption was that they belonged to men, hunters, shamans, the usual cast. Then in 2013, an archaeologist named Dean Snow took a careful look at the proportions, because it turns out the relative lengths of your fingers differ, on average, between men and women. The ratio between your index and ring fingers in particular. Snow ran the measurements on hand stencils from several French and Spanish caves, and the result was not subtle. By his analysis, a clear majority of the hands appeared to be female. 3/4 of them at some sites. It is worth being careful here, and I'd rather be careful than thrilling, because that's the deal we've made tonight. The method has its critics. The sample is small. Finger ratios overlap between the sexes more than anyone would like, and you cannot hang the whole prehistory of art on one statistical argument about knuckles. But even at its most cautious, the work did something that cannot be undone. It took the automatic of course it was a man, and replaced it with a real question, an open one, with actual evidence pointing toward women being there. Hands on the wall, in the deep flickering dark of the painted caves, present at the very birth of human image-making. Whoever they were, they reached up in the cold and left the most personal mark a body can leave. And it's still there, and on some nights that feels like more than enough to know. The ochre they used to do it, by the way, is about to turn up again. It was never just paint. Ochre is just iron-rich earth, red or yellow or brown, and the people we're spending tonight with were, by any reasonable measure, obsessed with it. They dug it out of the ground, sometimes from proper mines worked over thousands of years. They ground it on little stone pallets into powder so fine it floats. They heated it to shift its colour from yellow toward red. which is a genuine bit of chemistry, they had learned that fire transforms the stuff, and they did it on purpose. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, around 100,000 years ago, somebody assembled what can only be called a paint-making kit: ochre, crushed bone, charcoal, and a fluid, mixed and stored inside 2 abalone shells, the oldest known little workshop of its kind. Somebody set that down expecting to come back. They didn't, and so it waited for us. What was it all for? Some of it was the handprints and the cave walls, some of it was almost certainly the body. Ochre makes a pigment you can wear, and across cultures and millennia humans have marked their skin to say who they are, who they belong to, what they've survived. Some of it was practical in ways that surprised the people who first sneered at it as mere decoration. Ground ochre mixed into the glue that hafted a stone point to a shaft makes the glue stronger and more weather-resistant, so the red earth was, among other things, an ingredient in the most important adhesive of the age. And some of it went into the ground with the people who were gone, sprinkled over graves, packed around the remains, a deliberate red that meant something we can feel the shape of without being able to read. Who held the ochre? We can't sex a pigment, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the threads keep tugging the same direction. The figurines, the bodies, the textiles dyed pink and blue, the deep association between women and the colouring and adorning of skin and cloth and self that runs through so much of the human record. It's reasonable, and more than reasonable, to picture women among the chemists of the red earth, grinding it, heating it, testing it, deciding when the yellow had become the right red, holding in their heads a recipe with no written form and no name, passed hand to hand down a line of people who understood that a particular dirt, treated a particular way, could be made to mean almost anything. The grandmother by the fire knows where the good ochre is. Of course she does. She knows where everything is. A forager moving through an Ice Age landscape was walking through a pharmacy, a grocery, and a hardware store all at once, with no labels on anything and the steep penalty for misreading a shelf. And the person who held the most of that knowledge in her head was very often a woman, because the gathering of plants, for food, for medicine, for fibre, for poison, for the 100 small materials a life requires, was work she did daily, and taught early, and refined across decades. We're talking about an encyclopedia with no spine, stored entirely in living memory and spoken aloud, and it had to be very nearly perfect, because the difference between the plant that feeds you and the plant that ends the conversation can be a matter of a leaf's edge. We're not guessing at the medicine part. At a roughly 50,000-year-old Neanderthal site called El Sidron in Spain, researchers analysing the hardened plaque on the teeth, the diary again, always the teeth, found traces of yarrow and chamomile, plants with no real food value and a notably bitter taste, which means somebody wasn't eating them for pleasure or calories. They were almost certainly taking them as medicine. The same dental record showed one individual had been chewing poplar, which contains the natural compound that aspirin was eventually built from, and traces of a particular mould of the sort that produces antibiotics. And this is a Neanderthal, mind you, a member of the human family the cartoons treat as the dimmest of all, apparently self-medicating a painful condition with a painkiller and an infection fighter, tens of thousands of years before a pharmacy existed to sell them. Hold that next to the cartoon, and feel how far apart they are. The grunting brute of the old illustrations, and the actual person who knew that this bitter flower eased that particular ache, that this bark brought down a fever, that this root would help, and that nearly identical one would absolutely not, and who carried the whole branching library of it in her memory with no way to write a single entry down. When one of these women passed and her life ended, an entire pharmacology went with her, unless she'd already poured it, plant by plant and season by season, into a daughter or a granddaughter, which gives you a fresh and slightly aching reason to value the grandmother by the fire, the keeper not just of the embers, but of the index to the whole living world outside the cave. Lose her too soon and the band doesn't just grieve, it forgets which plant is which. And out here, forgetting is the thing you cannot afford. There is one experience that shaped the lives of these women more than any hunt, any winter, any migration, and the textbooks built around spear points managed to almost entirely overlook it, which tells you something about who was writing the textbooks. Childbirth, the most dangerous, most ordinary, most quietly heroic thing a person could do in the Stone Age, and a thing that human anatomy makes harder for us than for very nearly any other animal alive. Thanks to a cruel piece of evolutionary bookkeeping, we walk upright, which narrowed the pathway a baby must pass through, and at the same time we grow enormous brains, which means a large head trying to fit through a space that walking has spent millions of years making smaller. The technical name for the squeeze is the obstetrical dilemma, and every woman in this story lived on the far side of it, which is exactly why birth, almost everywhere humans are found, became something women did together. The cartoon woman is alone, alone at the cave mouth, alone in everything. But the real one, at the most dangerous hour of her life, was surrounded. This is sometimes called the midwifery hypothesis, the idea that the sheer difficulty of human birth selected for helping hands. For the experienced woman who had seen it before and knew what was normal and what was not, who could turn a baby or calm a panic, or simply hold a hand and say, "I have seen this, it will pass." The grandmother by the fire, again, of course she's there, she's seen more births than anyone, she's the closest thing the band has to a specialist, and her presence in that hour might be the difference between a story that ends well and one that doesn't. I'm going to keep this gentle, because we keep everything gentle here, and because the truth doesn't need any sharpening to land. Many did not come through it. The earth of the ancient world holds the quiet evidence of mothers and infants who didn't make it past that day. And there's a particular kind of grave, a young woman and a newborn laid to rest together, sometimes with real care, sometimes with beads or ochre, that you cannot look at without feeling the room go quiet across all those thousands of years. But many, many more did come through, obviously, or none of us would be lying here tonight. Every single person who has ever lived is the proof of an unbroken chain of mothers who survived this day, all the way back into the dark, not one link missing in all that time. That's the part I'd rather leave you holding. Every ancestor you have, without exception, made it through. The chain held. It held for so long that it reaches all the way down to you, lying warm under a blanket, awake for just a little longer. Once the baby arrived and the dangerous day was behind her, a new arrangement quietly took over, and it looked nothing like the picture of one exhausted mother alone with an infant against the cold. Human babies are absurd when you think about them with clear eyes, born helpless, staying helpless for years, demanding more or less constant attention at exactly the age when the band still needs the mother's hands for everything else that keeps it alive. The arithmetic doesn't work for a woman on her own. It only works if the load is shared, and so across most of human existence it was shared, in an arrangement anthropologists call alloparenting, which is a clinical word for the warm reality of a baby being passed around a circle of people who all, in their way, look after it. The sister carries the baby while the mother works the hide. The grandmother, naturally, minds 3 small ones at once by the fire, while their mothers are out with the nets. An older child, barely more than a baby herself, learns the whole job early by being handed a younger sibling and told in effect, mind your brother, which is how the skill passes down before anyone's old enough to question it. Even unrelated adults take a turn, because in a band of a few dozen people who will live and travel and depend on each other for their whole lives, the line between my child and our child blurs in a way that comfortable modern households, with their walls and their privacy, have largely forgotten. The baby is everyone's. It has to be. There's a real and slightly mind-bending idea threaded through this, argued by the anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, that we may have it backward when we treat the isolated nuclear family as the natural human default, and shared raising as some modern improvisation. It's very possibly the reverse. Our species may have become trusting, cooperative, intensely social, may have become human in the way we recognise, precisely because our babies were raised by many hands, looking up from the very start into a whole ring of faces instead of one, learning before they could speak that other people can be relied upon. If that's right, then some of the deepest and most likeable features of human nature were quietly built by women passing infants around a fire. And the cooperation we're so proud of as a species began as a practical solution to the simple fact that one woman could not do it all and was never ever asked to. The grandmother takes the baby. She's good with them. She's had practice that goes back further than anyone can count. Threaded through the soil of the Ice Age by the thousand are beads, tiny, drilled, deliberate, made of shell and bone and ivory and the teeth of animals, each one representing a startling amount of work. Drilling a single bead by hand with a stone point takes a long, patient stretch of time, and some of these garments come with hundreds, even thousands of beads sewn into them, which means the burial of a single well-dressed individual might represent thousands of hours of somebody's careful, close, eye-straining labour. At a site called Sungir in Russia, around 34,000 years ago, people were laid to rest wearing clothing sewn with thousands of carved ivory beads, and when you do the grim, patient math on how long it takes to make one bead and multiply it out, you arrive at a number of working hours so large it stops being decoration and starts being a statement about who that person was and how much the rest of them cared. These beads were not idle prettiness, and reading them that way is its own kind of mistake. A bead is portable wealth, light and durable and easy to carry through a nomadic life that couldn't accommodate heavy possessions. A pattern of beads says where you're from and who your people are, the way a particular weave or colour still does. A specific arrangement might mark that you're of an age to marry, or that you've come through some passage into adulthood, or that you hold some standing the rest of the group acknowledges on sight. This is information worn on the body, a language with no grammar but plenty of meaning, and somebody had to design it, make it, maintain it, and teach the children to read it. Work that sits squarely in the world of close handcraft and fibre and adornment that the threads keep tying back to women. And the truly remarkable thing about the beads is the order. The sequence isn't random, it repeats, it has rhythm, it follows rules. Somebody held a pattern in her head and reproduced it again and again across a garment that might take a year to complete, which is a kind of counting, a kind of structured thinking laid out in shell and ivory, arguably one of the deep roots of every ordered system we've built since. The grandmother by the fire wears a few old beads worn smooth with handling, and she could tell you exactly where each one came from, and who gave it to her, if anyone asked, which you'll have noticed the pattern by now. For a very long time, nobody did. The beads kept the count anyway. They were patient. They had nowhere to be. Of all the work that kept an Ice Age band alive, the one that gets the least glory and may have demanded the most relentless effort is the turning of a dead animal's skin into something that could keep a living person warm. And it is brutal, unglamorous, never-finished work that stood, quite literally, between the whole group and the cold that wanted them. A fresh hide is not a coat. Left alone it stiffens into board and then it spoils, and turning it into soft, durable, wearable leather is a long chemical and physical ordeal, scraping away every scrap of flesh and fat, working it for hours so it dries supple instead of rigid, often softening it with smoke or with substances I'll just gently note came from the animal's own body, and leave it at that. Because we keep things pleasant here even when prehistory didn't. We know who is doing a great deal of this, because the work signs its name on the body. Hide processing is repetitive, forceful and specific, and it leaves a distinctive pattern of wear and stress on the skeleton, in the arms, the shoulders, and especially, as we already saw, the front teeth. Because softening a hide very often meant gripping and pulling it with the mouth for hours at a stretch, day after day, year after year. The grooves on those teeth and the markers on those bones turn up heavily among women, and the conclusion is hard to dodge. A great deal of the warmth that made the Ice Age survivable was manufactured, garment by garment, by women working hides until their bodies kept a permanent record of it. Sit with the scale of it for a moment. In the warmth of wherever you're lying right now, everyone in the band depended, completely and without exception, on this work being done well. A poorly made garment in deep cold isn't a fashion problem, it's a slow emergency. And so the woman scraping a hide by the fire in the thin light of a winter afternoon was holding the temperature of the entire group in her cracked and aching hands. The thing the survival depended on most wasn't the dramatic moment of the hunt at all. It was the long, unglamorous afterward, the days of patient scraping and softening, the steady manufacture of warmth done mostly by women, recorded mostly in their bones, and remembered for a very long time by almost nobody. Tonight, at least, we remember it. Pull your own blanket a little closer. Somebody worked very hard, very long ago, so the principle of staying warm could reach you. It's worth stopping, about halfway down into the night, to ask where the other cave woman came from. The costume. The one waiting at the cave mouth. Because she's a real historical artifact too, just not from the Stone Age. She was manufactured much more recently, and we can practically read the receipt. When the science of prehistory got going in the 1800s, it was built almost entirely by gentlemen of a particular time and a particular set of assumptions about what women were for, and they walked into the deep past carrying those assumptions like luggage they didn't know they'd packed. They found a stone point by a skeleton and wrote hunter, male. They found a small carved woman and saw an object made by men for men's pleasure. They reconstructed a whole vanished world, and by remarkable coincidence, it came out looking like an idealized version of their own drawing rooms, with the men doing the important things and the women decoratively nearby. Then the 20th century took that quiet bias and put it on the big screen, and the cartoon set hard. The fur bikini, which would have been a frankly suicidal choice of garment in an actual ice age, and which no real evidence supports, was an invention of film, not prehistory. The man the hunter framework got dressed up in mid-century academic language and presented as settled science, with the entire story of human origins hung on male activity, male tools. Male aggression, while the female half of every population that ever existed, was reduced to a backdrop that cooked and waited. It was tidy, it was confident, it flattered the people telling it, and it was, in a great many of its particulars, simply not supported by the evidence once anyone bothered to look without the luggage. What's genuinely hopeful is watching the correction arrive, not as ideology, whatever anyone tells you, but as plain better science. The young hunter under the Andes turned up because someone checked the bones instead of assuming. The female hands on the cave walls turned up because someone measured the fingers instead of assuming. The string, The teeth, the beads, the medicine. None of it is a political argument. It's just what's actually there, finally being read by people who arrived without quite so much luggage, or at least with different luggage, because we all carry some. The old cavewoman, the one in the fur bikini, isn't a fact we discovered. She's a mirror earlier scientists held up to themselves without realizing it. And the real one has been standing patiently behind that mirror the whole time, slightly amused, scraping a hide, holding a baby, grinding the ochre, waiting for us to finally move the glass aside and see her. We're getting there. Slowly, which is the only speed that matters tonight. There's a question you'd never think to ask of these scattered bands until the chemistry answers it for you. And the question is simply, when two groups joined by marriage, who packed up and moved, and who stayed where they were born? It sounds unanswerable across so many thousands of years. And then it turns out the answer is sitting in the teeth and bones all along. Because the water you drink as a child, while your bones are forming, carries a faint chemical signature of the particular ground it came from, a trace of strontium that gets locked into you for life. Compare the signature in someone's teeth, formed in childhood, against the signature of the place they were buried, and you can tell whether they ended their life where they began it, or whether they came from somewhere else entirely. Researchers did exactly this at a set of early farming sites in Central Europe, and the pattern that emerged was strikingly consistent. The men tended to have grown up locally, their childhood signature matching the soil they were buried in, while a significant share of the women had come from elsewhere, their bones quietly carrying the chemistry of a different landscape, sometimes a distant one. The technical name is patriarchality, the men stay put, the women move at marriage, and that single finding rewrites the social texture of these groups in a way no spear point ever could. It means many of the women in any given band were, in a sense, immigrants, arriving from another valley with another set of skills and recipes and stories, carrying the knowledge of their birthplace into a new group and stitching the scattered human world together, one marriage at a time. Think about what that woman carried in beyond her beads. She brought a slightly different way of working a hide, a plant her new family didn't use, a song they didn't know, a memory of country none of them had seen. She was a bridge, and the network of these bridges, women moving between groups generation after generation, is a good part of how techniques and ideas and genes flowed across whole continents in an age with no roads and no writing. The grandmother by the fire, the one we keep returning to, she very likely wasn't born by this fire at all. She arrived here young from somewhere over the hills, and everything she knows that's kept this band alive, she carried in on foot across a cold landscape a very long time ago, and has been quietly handing out ever since. The woman who moved turns out to be one of the great unsung engines of the whole human story. Nobody waited at the cave mouth. Half of them had walked there from another world. Step a little further back, past our own kind entirely, to the woman the cartoons treat as the absolute bottom of the barrel, the Neanderthal, and prepare to have the cartoon dismantled one more time, because she may be the most slandered person in all of prehistory. We've already caught her self-medicating with the right plants at El Sidon. Add to that what the genetics revealed when researchers finally managed to read Neanderthal DNA, that they were not some separate failed experiment, but close enough kin to us that our own ancestors and theirs had children together, successfully repeatedly. Which is why most people alive today carry a small but real fraction of Neanderthal inheritance in their genes. That ancient meeting between two kinds of human wasn't a footnote. It's written into your own body. You may have a little of her in you right now, lying there in the dark. The Neanderthal woman was strong in a way that's hard to fully picture. Their skeletons show a robustness, a sheer physical power that suggests lives of intense effort in brutal conditions, And crucially, the wear patterns don't divide as neatly along the lines we'd expect. The signs of hard, forceful work, including the same hide processing tooth wear we keep meeting, show up across these populations in a way that hints women were doing the heavy, dangerous work right alongside everyone else, in small, tight-knit groups where the cold did not care who did the scraping so long as it got done. They made tools. They used pigment. They cared for their injured. There are Neanderthal skeletons showing individuals who survived terrible injuries and lived for years afterward, which only happens if someone is feeding you, sheltering you, choosing to keep you, when the cold arithmetic of survival might say otherwise. That last part is the part I'd hold on to as you drift. For 100 years the Neanderthal was the punchline, the brute, the evolutionary dead end shuffling off the stage so the clever ones could take over. And then we learned to read the bones and the genes properly, and the brute turned out to be someone who tended her sick, dosed her aches with willow and chamomile, decorated herself, worked as hard as anyone who ever lived, raised children who carried on, and, across that strange ancient meeting of two human kinds, left a quiet thread running all the way down into the people listening tonight. She wasn't lesser. She was family. She just lived on the far side of a gap so wide we forgot to look across it with any kindness. Until very recently. We're looking now. Let's gather a single ordinary day and lay it end to end. Because we've been collecting its pieces all night, and it's worth seeing the whole shape of it at last. Slowly. The way you'd retrace your own steps as you fall asleep. The fire is brought back from its embers in the cold dark by the woman who sleeps lightly. Water is fetched while the light is still thin, the walk done early so it isn't done late. Children wake into a ring of people rather than a single anxious parent, and are folded into the day's work as fast as they can be useful, which is younger than we'd think comfortable now. There is no single moment the day begins. It was already going before you opened your eyes. The work braids together through the short hours of light, and almost none of it matches the cartoon. A net is checked or mended, string again, always the string. A hide moves another stage along its long road from animal to warmth, scraped and worked and softened by hands that will carry the record of it forever. Plants come in from a gathering trip that's applied, in most seasons and most places, the dependable majority of what everyone actually ate, because the dramatic hunt was the unreliable jackpot, and the gathered plants were the steady wage that kept the band alive between jackpots. Someone grinds ochre. Someone drills a bead, one of the 1,000 a garment will need. Someone holds a baby so its mother's hands are free, and in an hour they'll trade. The grandmother watches 3 things at once and misses nothing, and has an opinion about all of it. And threaded through every part of that day is teaching, constant and invisible. Because in a world with no schools and no books, the only way anything survives is mouth to ear and hand over hand. Which plant, which not, which order the beads go in, how to tell the good ochre, how far the water is. What to do when the difficult hour of a birth arrives. The women in this story were, among everything else they were, the running memory of the species, teaching without ever calling it teaching. And the day was less a schedule than a slow, continuous transfer of everything one generation knew into the next, so that none of the hard-won knowledge fell out of the world when a single life reached its end. That's the real shape of the day. Not waiting. Never once waiting. A steady, capable, unending tending of the fire and the food and the children and the knowledge, the whole quiet machinery of keeping people alive, turning over and over, in the cold, in the light, and then in the cold again. I want to be honest with you, here in the quiet part of the night, about the size of what we don't know. Because a story that only tells you the confident parts isn't really telling you the truth about the past. So much of this is inference, careful and well supported, but inference all the same. The bones are real, the teeth are real, the strontium and the beads and the ochre are real. But the leap from this wear pattern to this woman's daily life is a leap, made as responsibly as people can make it. And honest researchers will tell you exactly where the solid ground ends and the reasonable guessing begins. We cannot hear their voices, we do not have their names, we don't know what they called the moon, or whether they feared the dark, or what they thought happened to the ones who were gone, though the careful graves suggest they thought it was something. The record is also cruelly uneven, and it's worth naming the bias in it. The soft things rotted, the string, the baskets, the slings, the wooden tools, very likely the great majority of what these people actually made and used, and the great majority of what women's hands produced, and so the picture survives weighted toward the hard, sharp, durable stuff, which is to say weighted, by sheer chemistry, toward exactly the activities we'd long assumed were men's. The imbalance in the evidence helped manufacture the imbalance in the story. We are, even now, partly reconstructing these lives from the rubbish that happened not to dissolve, and trying to imagine the vanished majority around the few hard fragments that stayed. The way you'd try to picture a whole tree from a handful of stones that once sat in its shade. But here's what I'd offer against all that uncertainty, as something solid enough to rest on. The not knowing is not a wall, it's an invitation, and the past has shown us again and again that it will answer better questions. Every certainty we've overturned tonight, the male hunter, the male artist, the brutish Neanderthal, the woman who only waited, was overturned not by deciding to believe something nicer, but by someone walking up to the evidence with humility and a willingness to be surprised, and being surprised. The strontium was always in the teeth, the fingers were always on the wall, the medicine was always in the plaque. It was all just sitting there, patient for 10,000 or 50,000 years, waiting for us to ask properly. There is so much we still can't know. There is also no reason at all to think we're finished finding out. The women in the ground are still keeping their count, the way they always did, waiting with no particular hurry for the next person to come along and finally read it. Fire is the technology underneath every other technology in this whole story, the one that makes the cold survivable and the meat digestible and the long dark evenings into something other than waiting for light, and the striking thing is how rarely anyone made it fresh. You don't start a fire from nothing every morning if you have any sense at all, because that's brutal, uncertain work. Far better to keep one alive, to bank it down at night under ash so it smoulders till dawn, to carry an ember with you in a bundle of slow-burning fungus or moss when the band moves on, so that the flame at the new camp is, in a real sense, the same flame as the old one. Some hearths, tended this way, may have burned continuously for a person's entire life, passed forward like an heirloom that happens to be on fire, which means somebody owned that responsibility, and it was rarely the most dramatic job and almost always one of the most important, and you already know who tended to hold it, because we met her in the opening hour, the one who sleeps lightly now, who wakes in the dark and brings the embers back before anyone else stirs. Keeping fire is patient, attentive, never-finished work that fits naturally alongside everything else the women of the band were doing, the gathering, the hide work, the minding of children, and it is the kind of work that rewards being always a little bit awake to it, always half listening for the dip in the glow. Let the fire go out in deep winter through carelessness, and you have created a genuine emergency for everyone. Keep it, quietly, every hour of every day, and nobody so much as notices, which is the eternal fate of the work that matters most. And the cooking that fire made possible was its own quiet revolution, easy to overlook because we're so used to it. Heat unlocks food, it breaks down what's tough, neutralizes what would otherwise trouble you, turns hard roots and risky plants and stubborn cuts into things a body can actually use, effectively pre-digesting your dinner before it reaches you, and handing back the energy that would have gone into chewing and processing it raw. Some researchers think this single trick, cooking, is part of how our ancestors could afford to grow such expensive, hungry brains in the first place, that the soft glow tended through the night by the lightly sleeping woman is, on a long enough timescale, tangled up in the very organ you're using to follow this sentence. She kept the fire. The fire, in its slow way, helped keep making us. None of it written down. All of it carried forward anyway, ember by ember, hand to hand, through every cold night there ever was. There is a thread you carry in your own cells that runs backward, unbroken, into exactly this world. A small loop of genetic material called mitochondrial DNA that passes down only from mother to child, never scrambled with the fathers, so that it forms a clean line reaching back through your mother, and hers, in a chain of women that does not stop until it disappears into the deep past we've been wandering through tonight. Follow that line back far enough and everyone alive converges on the same handful of ancestral mothers, and back further still on a single woman who lived in Africa a very long time ago, and whom geneticists nicknamed, a little grandly, Mitochondrial Eve. She wasn't the only woman alive in her day, nothing so dramatic as that. She's simply the one whose maternal line never once broke in all the generations since. The one daughter of daughters who carries through to all of us. What that machinery lets researchers do is genuinely astonishing when you sit with it. By reading the small accumulated changes in that maternal loop, they can sketch the great journeys, trace how groups of people and the women carrying these lineages spread out of Africa and across Asia and into Europe, and eventually everywhere, branching and drifting. Each branch a real woman who had a daughter who had a daughter. The whole peopling of the planet legible as a family tree written in the female line. The men's parallel story is there too, written in the Y chromosome. But it's the mother's thread that's the cleaner record, the one that ties the living straight back to the women in the cold. So when we talk about the Cavewomen tonight, we are not talking about some distant curiosity safely walled off in the past. We are talking, quite literally, about your however many times great-grandmother, a specific person, who woke in the cold and tended a fire and pulled fibre through her teeth and came through the most dangerous day, because if she hadn't, the loop in your cells would have ended with her and you would not be here to be sleepy about it. The grandmother by the fire isn't a metaphor. She's an ancestor, yours, mine, everyone's, and the line from her hands to yours has never once been cut, across all those tens of thousands of years, not even by the width of a single generation. That's not sentiment, that's molecular biology. You are the current end of her thread. Hold it lightly and let it carry you towards sleep. In 1823, in a cave on the Welsh coast called Paveland, an early geologist named William Buckland dug up a skeleton stained deep red with ochre and laid out with care, ivory rods and shells and rings arranged alongside the remains. And he looked at all this evidence of deliberate ceremonial burial and concluded, with the unshakable confidence we've come to expect from the gentleman of this story, that he had found a woman. A scarlet woman, in fact. He decided the ochre and ornaments marked her as a woman of low repute who'd plied her trade among a nearby Roman camp, and he named the find the Red Lady of Paveland, and that name has stuck for 200 years. He was wrong on essentially every count, which is almost too perfect. The remains weren't Roman. They're around 33,000 years old, among the oldest ceremonial burials ever found in Western Europe, laid down in the deep Ice Age when no Roman camp or anything like it existed. And the Red Lady was a young man, Buckland, working before anyone understood the true depth of human antiquity and carrying a head full of assumptions about what red pigment and ornaments on a body must mean, had reached confidently into the evidence and pulled out a story about a woman that the evidence simply did not contain. The exact mirror image of the mistake the rest of this story is built on, the assumption running the other way for once and landing just as wide of the mark. I love this case, and I've saved it for the quiet end of the night, because it's the whole lesson folded into one bright misunderstanding. For 2 centuries we mislabelled a young man as a fallen woman. For 1 century we mislabelled countless women as men, or as nothing at all, writing hunter, male beside their bones without a glance. Same error, both directions, walking up to the silent past and hearing your own assumptions echoed back, then mistaking the echo for a voice. The ochre on the Red Lady was real, the care was real, the 33,000-year-old grief was real. Everything Buckland added, the gender, the profession, the disrepute, came from him, not from the grave. And the only cure for it, the one this whole field has been slowly learning, is the same humble trick that surfaced again and again tonight. Stop telling the bones who they were, and let the bones tell you. They will. They're patient. They've waited this long. We have to talk carefully about how we fill in the blanks, because so much of what we think we know about the inner texture of these lives leans on watching people who, until very recently, lived in some broadly similar ways, foraging peoples documented over the last century or two, whose daily rhythms of gathering and sharing and child-rearing give us a living window onto possibilities the bare bones can't show us. When researchers worked closely with groups like the Jew Hoansi of the Kalahari in the 20th century and actually measured where the calories came from, they found that gathered plant foods, the women's daily, reliable contribution, supplied the dependable majority of the diet, while the celebrated hunt delivered the occasional feast and a great deal of the prestige. That single finding did more to crack the man-the-hunter story than almost anything dug out of the ground. But I want to be honest about the size of the asterisk on all of this, because it's a real one, and pretending otherwise would betray the deal we've made tonight. Living foragers are not Ice Age people preserved in amber. They are fully modern human beings with their own long histories, their own changes, their own entanglements with the wider world, and treating them as living fossils, as a window straight onto the Stone Age, is both scientifically lazy and quietly insulting to them as people of the present. The most we can responsibly say is that they widen our sense of what's possible for humans organised into small mobile groups. They show us that a society where women supply most of the food and move between bands and raise children in a shared ring of many hands is not some theorist's fantasy, but a thing humans actually do, and have done, in the real world. So we hold the mirror at arm's length, and we read it with care, and we let it suggest rather than dictate. It tells us the waiting woman at the cave mouth was never even a plausible arrangement, because no documented foraging society on Earth could afford to let half its adults specialise in idleness. It tells us that the gathered plant economy, the shared child-rearing, the women moving between groups, the deep practical knowledge held in women's heads, these aren't romantic projections backward. They're patterns that turn up wherever humans live close to the land in small groups, again and again. The bones give us the hard, silent facts. The living mirror, handled honestly, gives us a sense of the warmth and motion that once filled the space around those facts. Neither alone is the whole picture. Together, held with enough humility, they let us imagine her not as a costume or a skeleton, but as a person having an ordinary, capable, exhausting, fully human day, which is, in the end, the most we can offer her, and maybe the most she'd have wanted, simply to be seen plainly, doing the real work. At last, we've come a long way down into the dark together tonight, all the way back through tens of thousands of cold mornings to sit by a fire that went out before the first city was ever dreamed of. And now it's time to come quietly back up, slowly, the way you'd climb a gentle hill at dusk with no particular need to reach the top. Let's not leave her as a list of findings. Let's leave her as a person, because that's the truest thing we can do for someone who couldn't leave us her own account. She woke in the cold and brought back the fire. She knew 200 plants, and which of them would ease an ache and which would end a conversation, and she held all of it in her memory with no way on earth to write a word of it down. She pulled fibre through her teeth until they kept the record forever, and from that fibre she made the string that made the nets and the slings and the bags that quietly held a whole way of life together. She ground the red earth and decided when the colour was right. She drilled 1,000 beads in an order that meant something, and she could read that order on a stranger across a valley. She carried a baby on her hip and a younger sister's child on her back, and an entire library of knowledge in her head, and she walked it all from one valley to another when she married, stitching the scattered human world together a single journey at a time. She came through the most dangerous day a person could face. Or she didn't. And either way the chain of mothers behind her held unbroken for so long that it reaches, without one missing link, all the way to you, lying there warm in the dark. And when her own life reached its end, the people who loved her sometimes laid her down with ochre and beads, and a care we can still feel across all that distance, which tells us the one thing the bones can't quite say outright, that she mattered to somebody enormously while she was here. For 100 years we looked straight past her, because the people doing the looking were searching for spear points and for reflections of themselves, and she made no spear points and looked nothing like them. We dressed her in a costume she never wore, and sat her down to wait at a cave mouth she never had time to wait at, and we called that history. It wasn't. It was a mirror. The real woman was never waiting. She was working, knowing, teaching, carrying, making, holding the temperature of the whole group in her cracked and capable hands, and asking, as far as we can tell, for very little credit, which is exactly why it took us so long to give her any. She didn't write her name. She wrote everything else, in the grooves of her teeth, in the order of her beads, in the strontium of her bones, in the ochre on the wall, and in the long unbroken line of living people that ends, tonight, in you. So that's who the Cavewoman really was. Not a cartoon, not a costume. A chemist, a healer, a maker, a carrier, a keeper of the fire and the count and the knowledge, one of the quiet engines that kept our whole species moving forward through the cold and the dark, asking nothing, remembered by almost no one, and worth remembering more than almost anyone. The grandmother by the fire never did get her name in any book, but you stayed up a little while tonight just to think about her, and somewhere in the long arithmetic of being remembered, that counts. It counts more than you'd think. The fire's gone down to embers now. There's nothing left to do but let it. Wherever you are, whatever time it is there. And I hope you told me in the comments before your eyes got heavy, you're part of that unbroken line yourself. The newest link in a chain of people who kept each other warm and carried each other's knowledge forward through every cold night there ever was. You can set it down now. The string is knotted. The count is kept. The fire will hold till morning. Sleep well. Good night.